"Mama can't walk anymore," the little boy whispered, his voice breaking as the snow swirled around them. His trembling hands gripped his mother's coat, desperately trying to pull her upright. But the woman, pale and exhausted, slumped further into the snowdrift, her breathing shallow and strained. The boy's eyes, wide with fear, turned to the older man on horseback, who had just appeared like a ghost in the white wilderness. The cowboy, Gentry, paused for a moment, scanning the scene before him. A mother, a little girl clutching a rag doll, and the boy. No one else for miles. The storm had already claimed so much of the land, but it wasn't going to claim them. Without a word, Gentry dismounted. He didn't ask what happened, didn't need to. Time was running out for these three. He scooped the woman up in his arms, cradling her like a child, and called to the children, "Come on, get up, we'll get you somewhere warm." With the storm howling around them, he carried the family through the snow, not stopping until he reached his cabin, a small shelter he had built years ago, tucked away in the hills. Once inside, he set the woman down on a cot by the fire. Her children huddled close, eyes wide with fear, but also a touch of relief. There was warmth here, and for now, that was all they had. It was the winter of 1887, deep in the Wyoming Territory. Gentry had been out hunting, but the storm turned the world into a blur of white. He was heading back to his cabin when he spotted the woman and her children struggling through the thick snowdrift. The woman was stumbling, and the boy was tugging at her arm. But the girl, no older than 4, wasn't moving much at all. She was clinging to a doll, too cold to even cry. As Gentry approached, the woman collapsed. The boy, his face streaked with tears, cried out, "Please, mister, help us." The girl barely seemed to notice anything anymore. Gentry didn't hesitate. He carried the woman to his cabin, setting her by the fire while he helped the boy and the girl inside. There was no questioning, no asking for explanations. They needed warmth. They needed food. Gentry could worry about the rest later. When he took the woman's coat off, he noticed several strange things. The torn dress, the lack of supplies, the bruise on her wrist, and the small leather satchel she had clutched tightly, even in her unconscious state. It wasn't much to go on, but Gentry's instincts told him there was more to this woman's story than just exhaustion and cold. Gentry tended to the woman's injuries, checking her ankle for frostbite. He spoke gently to the children, tried to calm them. The boy, Tommy, was still crying, his little body trembling with fear. The girl, Lucy, was quiet, her small hands wrapped tightly around a rag doll. Gentry got a fire going, and once the cabin was warm enough, he made a broth to feed them. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Tommy, his tear-streaked face still full of worry, looked up at Gentry with a question. "Do you have kids?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Gentry's face darkened. "Not anymore," he answered, his voice flat. He didn't want to explain. Not yet. The memories were still too fresh. The fever that had taken his wife, Clara, and their daughter, Emma. He buried them both and kept his grief locked away ever since. But Tommy's innocent question had cracked something in him. And for the first time in a long time, the silence of his cabin felt suffocating. Sarah, the woman, woke up briefly, her eyes full of panic. She saw her children safe, huddled near the fire, but she was still trapped in a haze of fear and exhaustion. "He'll find us. He always does," she whispered, her voice trembling with dread. Gentry frowned. "Who will find you?" he asked, though he already suspected he wouldn't like the answer. "My husband," Sarah managed to say before passing out again. That first night in the cabin, everything was still, save for the crackling of the fire and the howling of the wind outside. The children were too scared to sleep, clinging to their mother, even though she was unconscious. Gentry sat in a chair near the fire, his eyes on the storm outside. He didn't trust it. He never trusted a storm. Tommy's voice broke the silence. "What's he going to do when he finds us?" Gentry looked at the boy. "Who?" he asked, though he already knew. "My pa," Tommy said softly. "He's mean. He hurts Mama." His voice cracked as he spoke. "I don't want him to find us." Gentry didn't know what to say. A man who would hurt his own family. Those kinds of men were dangerous. And Tommy was right. Sarah's husband would come looking for them. It was only a matter of time. Gentry settled back in his chair, his hand resting on the rifle at his side. He wasn't sure how much help he could be to these people, but he was going to try. He had to. The storm was bad enough, but the man they were running from might be worse. When morning came, the cabin was quiet. The fire was low, and the storm outside had only intensified. The children woke, confused and disoriented by the warmth and unfamiliar surroundings. They hadn't seen a place like this in weeks. Gentry was already up, tending to the fire and preparing some food. The boy, Tommy, looked at him with a mix of curiosity and gratitude. He'd probably never had a meal like this before. "Are we safe here?" Tommy asked hesitantly. "For now," Gentry replied. He gave the boy a reassuring smile, though he didn't fully believe it. The storm had blocked the pass, but it wouldn't last forever. Eventually, someone would come looking for them. Lucy, still clutching her rag doll, shuffled over to Gentry. "This is Rosie," she said, holding up the doll with pride. "She's my friend." Gentry smiled, a small, rare smile. He didn't know why, but it felt good to see the little girl find some comfort in something so simple. After a few hours, Sarah finally woke up properly. She saw her children safe and sound and cried with relief, her tears mixing with the snowflakes still clinging to her skin. When she tried to stand, Gentry gently stopped her, noticing how weak she was. Her ankle was badly sprained. "The storms blocked the pass," Gentry said. "Nobody's going anywhere for 3 days." Sarah's face seemed to relax at that news, but there was still something darker in her eyes. Fear. It was hard to ignore. Gentry pressed her for answers. "Who's looking for you?" Sarah's gaze shifted to her children, her expression a mix of relief and fear. "My husband," she said softly. I don't know where he is. Hopefully dead, but probably not." Gentry found himself standing at a crossroads. He couldn't turn them away, not when he had nowhere else to go. But he had his own troubles to deal with, and a dangerous man was hunting them. Time was running out. He couldn't let them stay here forever. But the storm was still howling outside, and tomorrow wasn't promised. Gentry had 3 days, and after that, the storm would break, the pass would clear, and Sarah and her children would have to face the dangerous man chasing them. What was he going to do? The storm raged outside for what felt like forever, trapping Gentry, Sarah, and her children in the small cabin with no choice but to face the tension that lingered in the air. The wind howled, and the snow continued to fall in thick, unforgiving sheets, but inside, the heat of the fire and the closeness of the cabin made things feel stifling. Sarah could barely walk, her ankles swollen and raw from the frostbite. Gentry, despite the awkwardness, tended to her injuries, cleaning and dressing the wounds with the care of someone used to solitude and self-reliance, but not with much experience handling another person's pain. Every time his hands came too close to her skin, she flinched, and each time, he tried to ignore the sharp sting of her reaction. "That's what he said too." "At first," Sarah murmured, her voice distant as she stared into the fire. Gentry paused, surprised. "I'm not him," he replied, his tone firm, though he knew she wasn't really speaking to him. They both knew the unspoken truth of violence in homes. And even though Gentry had built walls against the world after losing his family, it didn't stop the sorrow in his eyes when Sarah's fear resurfaced. Tommy helped out by stacking wood near the stove, doing his best to be useful despite his obvious nervousness. "My pa never taught me nothing but how to duck," he said quietly, glancing at Gentry as if asking for something he didn't know how to ask for. Gentry gave the boy a small nod, offering him the silent assurance of someone who'd learned too much about the world's harshness too young. Later, he whittled a small wooden horse for Lucy, who watched with wide eyes, a tentative smile beginning to form as the toy took shape. Sarah watched them both, the sight of a man and child working together, sharing something so simple, yet so foreign to her. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Sarah spoke more about her past, her voice heavy with the weight of memories she clearly tried to forget. She had married Marcus Thornton when she was just 16, swept up in his charm and the promise of a life on a successful ranch in Colorado. At first, he had seemed kind, a man with big dreams and an eye for the future. But as the years passed, his true nature emerged, and it was one of control, domination, and cruelty. He isolated her, turning her world into something she couldn't escape, even when she tried. The beatings started after Tommy was born, each one escalating until Marcus nearly killed her in a fit of rage. Tommy had tried to protect her, and Sarah couldn't bear the thought of what her husband's anger had done to her son. So, in the middle of the night, she fled, taking only what she could carry and leaving everything behind. "I've been running for 3 weeks," Sarah finished quietly, her voice shaking. Gentry felt his anger rise, his protective instincts flaring as he looked at the woman who had survived so much. "Men like that don't let go," he muttered, his fists tightening around his coffee cup. He knew how dangerous a man like Marcus could be. His own guilt gnawed at him, the feeling that he hadn't protected his own family when they needed him the most. He couldn't stop thinking about Sarah's courage, but at the same time, fear gripped him. It wasn't just the danger of Marcus. It was the fear of getting involved. "You're safe for now," he said, though doubt lingered in his voice. But men like that, they don't stop. They never stop. Later, as the evening wore on and the fire crackled low, Tommy suddenly spoke up, his voice full of dread. "Mama, what if he goes to Sheriff Davis?" The room went quiet, Sarah's face draining of color. "Who's Sheriff Davis?" Gentry asked, the question hanging in the air like an unspoken danger. Sarah swallowed hard, her eyes flickering between her children before she answered, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's my husband's brother. The law in this part of the territory." Gentry's stomach dropped as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The law might not help them. In fact, it could make everything worse. The thought of Marcus's brother being in a position of power made him uneasy. "The law will be looking for you too," he said grimly. "And they might not be looking to help." The next day, as the storm still kept them trapped in the cabin, the children began to adjust. Lucy, who had barely spoken since their arrival, showed Gentry her beloved rag doll, Rosie, and in that moment, Gentry realized how much she had been clinging to something familiar. Tommy, ever the little man, took over stacking wood for the fire, and Gentry, seeing the boy's determination, asked him if he knew how to handle a rifle. "I can shoot," Tommy said quietly. "My pa taught me." Gentry's heart sank at the thought of what that might mean, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he showed Tommy how to hold the gun safely, teaching him the importance of respect for the weapon rather than the violence it could inflict. "A rifle is a tool," Gentry explained, "not a weapon. You use it to protect what's yours." That afternoon, while the children were playing by the fire, Lucy knocked over the satchel that Sarah had been holding on so tightly. The contents spilled onto the floor. Coins, worn clothes, and a letter, its edges frayed from constant handling. Sarah froze when she saw the letter. She slowly picked it up, her hands trembling as she opened it and began to read aloud, her voice thick with emotion. "Dear Sarah, I told you not to marry him. You thought love could change a cruel man. It cannot. If you ever find the strength to leave, run far. You deserve love that makes you brave, not small. Your loving mother." The letter's words cut through the room like a knife, and Gentry could feel the weight of them. Sarah's mother had known the truth, had seen the man Marcus truly was, and yet Sarah hadn't been able to listen. "My mother died 6 months after I married Marcus," Sarah murmured, her voice cracking. "I never got to tell her she was right." The letter was a reminder of everything Sarah had lost, and Gentry felt a knot tighten in his chest. He could see how much it hurt her to face the past. And yet, In some ways, it seemed to give her a measure of strength. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small silver locket that had once belonged to his daughter Emma. He hadn't shared this with anyone, but in that moment, he felt the need to. "I know how it feels," Gentry said softly, his voice low and filled with grief. "I lost my daughter to fever, and my wife, Clara, she didn't survive it either. She walked into a winter storm, and I couldn't stop her. I wasn't enough reason for her to stay." His words were heavy with the kind of loss that never truly heals. And Sarah, for the first time since they met, reached out and placed her hand gently over his. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not turning us away." He looked down at her hand, feeling a sense of connection he hadn't felt in years. "You brought noise back into my life," he said quietly. "Maybe that's what I needed." The night ended quietly, both of them lost in their own thoughts. But there was a shift in the air. The storm outside hadn't yet passed, but inside there was something different, something that felt like the beginning of something more. The morning came with the promise of the storm breaking, but the new day brought with it a new sense of urgency. The past would clear by tomorrow morning, and Sarah would have to make a decision: stay with Gentry or face the unknown and the danger that Marcus might still be close. Gentry checked the weather outside, his eyes hardening as he came back inside. "Storm's breaking. Past will clear by tomorrow morning." Sarah's expression shifted, a mix of relief and terror crossing her face. They couldn't stay here forever. They would have to leave. But even as they packed, Gentry couldn't shake the feeling that something dangerous was coming. They had until morning to make their choice, and the clock was ticking. The next morning, as the sun struggled to break through the gray clouds, Gentry sat at his table, a map spread out in front of him. Sarah was preparing breakfast, her movements still tentative but growing more confident as the days passed. The children were quietly playing by the fire, the sounds of their laughter a small but bright thing in the otherwise still cabin. Gentry looked up from the map and turned to Sarah. "Where were you headed?" he asked, his finger tracing the route across the page. Sarah hesitated for a moment before answering, her voice low. "Oregon Territory. I have a cousin there, I think." Gentry raised an eyebrow. "That's 600 miles away, through winter, with 2 children and no wagon." He sighed, shaking his head. "You'll never make it." The words were blunt, but they were also the truth. Sarah's face hardened, and she stood up straight, her gaze determined. "I'll die trying before I go back," she said, her voice fierce. Gentry felt a pang of sympathy for her, but also a deep frustration. "And what about the children?" he asked. "What if they died too?" The question hung in the air, heavy with its implications. Sarah clenched her fists, anger flashing in her eyes. "Don't you dare judge me," she snapped. "I'm protecting them." Gentry stood up, his own frustration rising. "Protecting them by walking into certain death. You can't protect them if you're not alive." The tension between them crackled, and for a moment, neither spoke. Gentry's thoughts turned inward to his own grief, his own sense of failure. But then, slowly, the anger faded from his voice. "Stay until spring," he said after a long silence. The word surprised both of them. 3 more months. The storm season will pass, and by then, the wagons will be running again. I'll get you on one with supplies, money, whatever you need. Sarah's eyes searched his face for any hint of insincerity, but she didn't find any. "Why would you do that?" she asked, her voice softening. Gentry's expression was unreadable, but his voice was steady. "Because I couldn't save my family," he said quietly. "Maybe I can save yours." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken emotions. After a long pause, Sarah nodded. "All right, we'll stay, but I won't be a burden on you." Gentry didn't reply, but he knew that the decision had been made. And as he set to work building a plan for the weeks ahead, he felt the weight of the responsibility settle on his shoulders. The cabin would be a safe place for now, but there was still much to do. He made the terms clear. Sarah and the children would stay in the loft, and Gentry would take the room below. He would teach Sarah to shoot, an essential skill in a world where danger often lurked just outside the door. "If anyone comes, you use the rifle," Gentry told her, his voice firm but not unkind. "You don't hesitate." Over the next few days, Gentry and Sarah worked side by side, the tension slowly giving way to something else. Sarah was a quick learner. Even though the first time she held a rifle, her hands trembled. Gentry stood behind her, guiding her hands, his body close enough for her to feel the heat of him. But he kept his touch impersonal. "Aim for the target's center mass. Don't hesitate," he instructed, his voice low and steady. She fired, and the bullet went wide, but Gentry didn't criticize. "You'll get better," he assured her. "Just keep your focus." The days were filled with small victories and awkward moments. Tommy, eager to learn, asked about gun safety, and Gentry patiently taught him how to hold a rifle properly, how to respect its power. But Gentry could see that Tommy wasn't the type to shy away from a fight, and it worried him. The boy had already learned too much about survival at such a young age. Lucy, on the other hand, seemed to find comfort in the simplest things. She followed Gentry around the cabin, watching him carve wood or check traps, her little voice always asking questions. "Why do you carve wood?" she asked one day as she sat beside him. Gentry smiled, his hand pausing over the piece he was shaping. "It's something to do with my hands," he said simply. "Something to make the days feel less empty." Over the next few weeks, Gentry found himself opening up more than he had in years. Sarah, though still quiet about some things, began to speak more about her past, her hopes, and her fears. Slowly, Gentry started to see her not as a woman running from a dangerous man, but as someone who had survived, who had fought to protect her children. And for the first time in a long time, he started to believe in the possibility of a future beyond his own grief. Christmas came, and though the storm outside was unrelenting, the cabin became a place of warmth and fleeting joy. Sarah wanted to make it special for the children, began to plan a small celebration. Gentry helped secretly, carving small toys for the kids and saving the last of his sugar for a simple treat. On Christmas Eve, the fire crackled as Gentry played his harmonica, a song that seemed to make the air feel lighter. Lucy, exhausted from the day, fell asleep in his lap, her small head resting against his chest. Gentry looked down at her, his heart aching with a mixture of tenderness and something else he hadn't expected to feel: hope. Sarah sat quietly across from him, watching, her eyes soft with unspoken emotion. When the children were tucked in for the night, Sarah approached him. "Do you regret letting us stay?" she asked quietly, her voice full of uncertainty. Gentry looked up from the fire, his face unreadable. "Why would I regret that?" he replied, his voice a little rougher than he intended. Sarah hesitated before speaking again. "We've disrupted your peace. I know that." Gentry's gaze softened, and he stood to pour himself another drink. "I thought I wanted peace," he said, almost to himself. "Turns out, I just wanted silence." He paused, his fingers tightening around the glass. Peace is healing. Silence is just not being dead yet. There was a quiet understanding between them, a shared recognition of the pain they both carried. Sarah stood up and approached him slowly, her eyes meeting his with a mix of gratitude and something deeper, something unspoken. "You brought noise back into my life," she said softly. "Maybe that's what I needed." Gentry didn't respond, but as he watched her, he felt something shift. The storm outside was still fierce, but the storm inside the cabin, between them, had started to quiet, replaced by something warmer, something worth fighting for. As Gentry looked out the window toward the fading storm, he knew the past would soon clear, and they would have to make a choice. Sarah's life was in his hands, and he couldn't stop thinking about what the future might hold. Could he really help her and her children escape the danger that was closing in? And would he be able to protect them if Marcus Thornton found them? The clock was ticking. The days passed quietly, but a sense of tension simmered beneath the surface the calm before the storm. The first signs of spring appeared, the snow beginning to melt and the days stretching longer. Yet every morning Gentry woke with the same knot in his stomach, knowing that soon they would have to make a decision. He and Sarah had settled into a routine, their days filled with practical tasks, chopping wood, tending to the fire, teaching the children, and even sharing small moments of laughter. But in the quiet moments between chores, when their eyes met across the room or their hands brushed in passing, something unspoken passed between them. There was an undeniable pull, a connection that neither of them was willing to fully acknowledge. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was something else, something deeper. One day, while hanging laundry outside, Gentry's hand brushed against Sarah's as they reached for the same clothespin. A small moment, but it felt like the world had shifted for an instant. Their faces were inches apart, breath visible in the cold air, and Gentry's hand hovered near her face, the temptation to touch almost overwhelming. But before he could make any move, Tommy called out from the cabin, breaking the moment and pulling them both back into reality. Neither spoke of it afterward, but the air between them had changed. Sarah, who had been so closed off when they first met, seemed to be letting herself soften around him. She spent more time with Lucy, teaching her how to read, even showing Gentry a few words she had learned from a book her mother had kept hidden away. Tommy, on the other hand, was growing more comfortable with Gentry, though there were still moments when his eyes would darken with memories of his father, and Gentry could see the fear in his eyes when he caught sight of a man outside the cabin. It was clear that the boy still carried the weight of what his father had done to him and his mother. One afternoon, Lucy came running into the cabin with a drawing in her hand, her face lit up with excitement. "Look, Mr. Jin," she said, showing him the picture she had made. It was a crude but heartwarming drawing of the cabin, with 4 figures in front: Sarah, Tommy, Lucy, and Gentry, all standing together in the sunshine. Underneath, she had written in her childlike scrawl, "Our family." Gentry's chest tightened at the sight of it. He hadn't realized how much this life, this makeshift family, had come to mean to him. Sarah, too, saw the picture and smiled, her expression a mix of pride and sadness. "Sweetie," she said gently, "we're leaving when spring comes, remember?" Lucy's face fell, but she didn't argue. Tommy, on the other hand, was less willing to accept the idea. "We're not his family," he said flatly, his voice hard as he glanced toward Gentry. The words stung more than Gentry expected, but he understood. Tommy didn't want to hope for something that couldn't last, not after everything he had been through. The tension between them felt palpable as Gentry stood there, unsure of how to respond. He had become part of their lives, but he knew that part of him still wasn't ready to claim it. That evening, as the fire crackled on the hearth, Sarah found Gentry outside, chopping wood with more force than necessary. The weight of the axe seemed to match the weight of the silence that had settled between them in recent days. She stepped up to him, her voice quieter than usual. "The pass is almost clear," she said. 2 weeks. That was the deal." Gentry paused in his swing, the axe hanging in the air for a moment. He knew what she was saying, knew the time was coming when they would have to part ways. "I know," he muttered, his voice rough. There was a long silence between them, the air heavy with things unsaid. Finally, Gentry set the axe down, looking her in the eye for the first time in days. "Somewhere along the way, I stopped doing this for my past and started doing it for my future," he said, the words feeling like a confession. "I have feelings for you, Sarah. I needed to say it once." Sarah's expression softened, but the walls she had built were still there, protecting her from the rawness of her own emotions. "I'm terrified," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. Gentry's heart clenched, and he took a step closer, his eyes searching hers. "Of me?" he asked. She shook her head, her gaze falling to the ground. "Of wanting something again. Every time I've wanted, it's been taken," she said, her voice trembling. The words hung heavy in the air, the weight of her past a constant shadow between them. "I'm not him. Gentry said, his voice firm, though he could feel the same fear creeping into his own chest. I know, Sarah whispered, her eyes lifting to meet his again. That's why I'm terrified. You make me want to stop running. The moment between them stretched, charged with the promise of something they both feared but longed for. But before they could say anything more, the sound of horses approaching interrupted them. Gentry froze, his instincts kicking in. He quickly turned, scanning the horizon. There in the distance, he saw a rider, a lone figure cutting through the snow. Gentry's heart sank as he recognized the man. It wasn't Marcus, but it could be just as dangerous. He turned to Sarah, his expression hardening. Stay inside, he ordered, his voice low and controlled. I'll handle this. As the man drew closer, Gentry took a deep breath, his hand instinctively going to the rifle he kept by the door. The man dismounted, his eyes scanning the cabin before landing on Gentry. Name's Pike, he said, his voice rough. Horse through a shoe. Need shelter for the night. Gentry's eyes narrowed, scanning the man's weathered face. There was something off about him. His gaze flickered too much, his hand resting just too casually on his sidearm. You're not just a traveler, are you? Gentry said, his voice sharp. Pike's eyes twinkled with amusement, but there was a hint of danger in them. I ain't looking for trouble, he said, but Gentry didn't buy it. You know any Callahans around here? Pike asked, his eyes flicking toward the cabin. I hear he's living alone, out here in the hills. Gentry didn't answer, but the silence was enough. Pike's gaze shifted to Sarah, who was standing by the window, her face a mask of fear. Didn't hear he found himself a wife. Pike remarked casually, but Gentry saw the way his eyes lingered on Sarah. Recent, Gentry replied curtly, stepping in front of her. Well, it's a good thing I came along then, Pike said, turning to leave. But just as he reached the door, he stopped and looked back. By the way, he said, his voice laced with something darker, there's a man in Denver paying good money for information about a runaway wife and 2 kids. Marcus Thornton, offering $500 for their whereabouts. The words hit like a thunderclap, and Gentry's blood ran cold. Pike didn't wait for a response. He tipped his hat and walked out, but the damage was already done. Gentry's gaze turned to Sarah, who was pale, her hands trembling as she gripped the rifle. Pike's words had cut through the fragile calm they had built. Marcus was close, and the clock was ticking. The decision was made for them. There was no more running. They would have to stand and fight. The storm had brought them here, but it was no longer the only danger they faced. Marcus Thornton was coming, and this time he would not be stopped. The following morning, the air was thick with tension, and Gentry's mind raced as he set to work fortifying the cabin. He began by boarding up the windows, turning the small home into a fortress, ensuring that every possible entry point was secured. There was no more time for hesitation or second-guessing. The storm outside had subsided, but the threat was now clear. Marcus Thornton and his men were coming, and they were coming for Sarah and her children. Gentry knew that the odds were stacked against them, but he wasn't about to let them fall into the hands of a man like Marcus. He moved quickly, his every action purposeful as he prepared for the fight ahead. Sarah, though visibly shaken, was determined to do her part. She helped as best as she could, despite her sprained ankle, carrying what little supplies they had and organizing the children. Tommy, eager to prove himself, tried to be as helpful as possible, but Gentry knew he was still just a boy. He couldn't let Tommy take on too much. Your job is more important, Gentry told him as he handed the boy a rifle. You need to protect your mother and sister. If things go wrong, you get them out. Understand? Tommy nodded, his face serious, though his eyes betrayed the fear that gnawed at him. It was a responsibility no child should have to bear, but in these circumstances, there was no other choice. As Gentry finished the final touches on the barricade, he turned to Sarah, who had been watching him work in silence. He handed her a rifle, one he had made sure was light enough for her to handle. You'll need this, he said. Don't hesitate. If anyone comes through that door, you shoot to protect your family. She nodded, though her hands trembled slightly as she took the weapon. She wasn't the woman who had stumbled through the snow weeks ago anymore. This woman had strength in her, and Gentry could see it now. She was no longer the terrified wife of an abusive man. She was a mother who would do anything to keep her children safe. As they prepared for what was to come, there was an unspoken understanding between Gentry and Sarah. No matter the outcome, they would face it together. They weren't alone anymore. The children were settled in the cellar with a small stash of food, hidden away in case the worst came to pass. Gentry and Sarah shared a brief moment of quiet, their eyes meeting across the cabin, a wordless promise between them. But there was no time to dwell on what-ifs. They both knew that the danger was real, and it was coming fast. That night, they heard the sound of hooves in the distance, the unmistakable sound of men on horseback. Gentry's heart pounded as he checked his rifle one last time. The time had come. They couldn't run anymore. They couldn't hide. When the first men arrived at dawn, it was as Gentry had expected. 4 of them, led by Marcus Thornton, with the sheriff's brother among them. Gentry stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand, ready to face whatever came next. Marcus's cold, calculating gaze locked onto him as he dismounted, his voice cutting through the still air. "Sarah, come out. Bring my children." The words sent a chill down Sarah's spine, but she didn't flinch. She stepped out from behind the door, her face set in a mask of determination, a pistol in her hand. "No," she said firmly, her voice carrying. "I don't belong to anyone. Not anymore." Marcus's eyes darkened, a flash of anger crossing his features. "Come here, Sarah." "Now," he growled, but Sarah didn't move. The standoff between them was tense, the air thick with the threat of violence. Gentry stepped forward, positioning himself between Sarah and Marcus. "You're trespassing," he said, his voice calm but full of authority. "Leave now, or I'll make you leave." Marcus sneered, his hand resting on the hilt of his gun, but he didn't draw it. "You really think you can stand up to me?" he asked, his tone dripping with contempt. "That's my wife, and those are my children. You can't keep them." Gentry didn't hesitate. "You don't have the right to claim them," he said, his voice unwavering. "Not anymore." Marcus's face twisted in fury. "I'll burn this cabin down if I have to," he threatened, his voice low and dangerous. Gentry's grip on his rifle tightened. "You try it," he said, his voice deadly quiet. Sarah raised her pistol, her hand steady now, and aimed it at Marcus. "Try," she said, her voice cold and resolute. Marcus looked from Sarah to Gentry, his eyes filled with rage. Without warning, he signaled to his men, and the gunfight erupted. The world exploded into chaos, gunfire, shouting, and the sharp crack of wood splintering as bullets flew. Gentry and Sarah ducked inside, taking cover behind whatever they could find. Tommy and Lucy were safe in the cellar, but Gentry couldn't afford to think about them right now. His focus was on Marcus and the men outside. The gunfight was fast and brutal. Gentry's shots were precise, taking down one of Marcus's men, forcing another to retreat. But Marcus wasn't backing down. Gentry could hear him shouting orders, could feel the desperation in the air. The man wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. Gentry had to end it. Through the smoke and chaos, Marcus lunged toward the porch, a torch in hand. Gentry saw him coming and moved quickly, but Marcus was faster, throwing the torch onto the wooden porch. The flames caught almost immediately, spreading rapidly. Gentry's heart raced as the fire began to consume the cabin. "Get them out," he shouted to Sarah, his voice rising over the crackling flames. "Go now." Sarah hesitated only for a moment, grabbing Tommy and Lucy and heading for the cellar door. Gentry covered them, firing back at the remaining men, but the fire was spreading too fast. The cabin, their refuge, was burning. Marcus, seeing the flames, realized he had lost, but he wasn't going to leave without one last attempt at control. He charged at Gentry, and the 2 men clashed in a brutal hand-to-hand struggle. Gentry fought with everything he had, but Marcus was stronger, pushing him to the ground and pinning him with all his weight. "She was mine," Marcus snarled, his fingers tightening around Gentry's throat. Gentry gasped for breath, but as Marcus's grip tightened, a shot rang out. Marcus's body jerked, and he collapsed, falling lifeless to the ground. Sarah stood there, her pistol smoking, her hands shaking, but her expression filled with a quiet strength. "I'm not yours anymore," she said softly, her voice filled with a finality that made Gentry's heart swell. The fire was too much to contain, and with no time left, Gentry grabbed the supply bag, and the three of them fled into the woods, leaving the cabin behind. They watched from a distance as the flames consumed everything. The life they had built together, the home that had started to feel like something real, was gone. But they were alive. They were together. And that was all that mattered. The journey to town was slow and exhausting. The snow now nothing but muddy patches underfoot, but the weight of their survival pushed them forward. Gentry led the way, keeping a steady pace, though his body ached from the fight and the long nights without rest. Sarah, Tommy, and Lucy followed closely behind, their exhaustion evident, but their spirits had shifted. For the first time since Gentry found them in the snow, there was a quiet hope in the air. Tommy, his usual guarded silence replaced by curiosity, asked questions about the land, the town, and even the prospect of what lay ahead. Lucy, her face full of innocence, wondered aloud where they would live. "Wherever we're together," Gentry replied, his words simple, but carrying a depth of emotion he didn't fully understand himself. They walked through the small frontier town of Jackson's Creek a few days later, the sight of it both foreign and comforting after everything they had been through. Gentry knew the sheriff here, a good man who had once helped him with a stray cattle dispute, and he knew this was where their fight for freedom would find its rightful place. The town was busy with the usual chatter of small-town life, but as they entered, they were greeted with a mix of curiosity and compassion. The real sheriff, an older man with a weathered face, listened carefully as they explained what had happened. Gentry stood by Sarah's side, his arm instinctively resting protectively over her shoulder as she recounted everything. Marcus, the abuse, the escape, the fire. The sheriff nodded, his brow furrowing in concern as he made notes. He didn't question their story. There was no doubt in his eyes. He knew men like Marcus. The process wasn't immediate, but it was thorough. Evidence was gathered, and though Sarah's bruises had mostly healed, they were still visible enough to prove the truth of her story. The children, though frightened, spoke up about the cruelty they had witnessed. The sheriff's office was patient, letting them speak in their own time. After several long hours, the decision came. Sarah was granted widow status, and the children, now safe, were under her full custody. Marcus Thornton's death was ruled self-defense, and the land that had once been his was now Sarah's, though she refused to claim it. "I don't want anything from that life," she said firmly, her voice steady for the first time since they arrived. Gentry stood beside her, proud of her strength, but understanding the pain that came with it. As they left the sheriff's office, the weight of what had happened began to settle. Sarah had been granted the freedom she had fought for, but there was still more to do. The town doctor, a gentle man who had listened to Sarah's story with compassion, approached her with an offer. "We need a nurse," he said. "I know you don't have formal training, but you have steady hands and a kind heart. I can teach you." Sarah looked at Gentry, her face full of uncertainty, but he nodded encouragingly. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "Yes," she said finally, her voice stronger. "I accept." It was the first real job offer Sarah had ever received, and it marked a new beginning for her, a chance to build a life that didn't revolve around survival. The children, too, had their future ahead of them. Tommy, still nervous about fitting in, was enrolled in the local school, though he was hesitant about how the other kids would treat him. But the teacher, a kind woman, reassured him. Every child deserves kindness and education. she said, and Tommy, though shy, finally gave a small smile. Lucy, full of excitement, asked if she would learn to read like Tommy, and the teacher promised her that she would. The town rallied around them, offering help in ways Gentry hadn't expected. The blacksmith, a burly man with a kind heart, offered him work, saying, "A good man who helps others is always needed." They were given a small house to rent. Nothing grand, but it was theirs. It was warm and safe, and for the first time, Gentry realized it was enough. One evening, after a long day of settling into their new lives, Tommy, who had grown attached to Gentry in ways he hadn't expected, asked quietly, "What do I call you now?" Gentry looked down at the boy, his throat tight with emotion. "What do you want to call me?" he asked, his voice gruff. Tommy's eyes dropped, a shyness he rarely showed creeping into his expression. Could I call you Pa?" he asked, his voice small but filled with hope. Gentry knelt down to the boy's level, feeling a lump in his throat. "I'd be honored, son," he said, his voice breaking slightly. Tommy hugged him tightly, and soon Lucy joined them, calling out in her sweet voice, "Papa Jen." It was a simple thing, but it meant everything. A few weeks later, as they walked together on the outskirts of town, Gentry stopped and turned to Sarah, the night sky full of stars above them. The mountains loomed in the distance, and for a moment, it felt like the weight of the world had finally lifted. He took her hand and, with a deep breath, dropped to one knee. "I have nothing to offer but myself," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "These hands, this heart, but they're yours if you want them." Sarah's eyes welled with tears, and without hesitation, she nodded. "I want them," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I want you." The children, standing nearby, cheered, and in that moment, it felt like everything they had been through, everything they had lost, had led them here to this place of love, healing, and second chances. 3 weeks later, in a small church with a simple ceremony, Gentry and Sarah were married. The children stood with them at the altar, their faces bright with joy. The vows were simple but profound. "I promise to be the man you need," Gentry said, his voice steady but filled with love. "The father they deserve, and love you until my last breath." Sarah's voice trembled as she spoke her vows. "I promise to stand beside you, trust you, and build a home filled with laughter instead of fear." The ceremony was short, but the joy in the room was undeniable. They were surrounded by the town's people, a community that had embraced them with open arms. That evening, as the sun set behind them, Gentry and Sarah stood on the porch of their new home, the children playing at their feet. The air was warm, the house full of light, and for the first time in years, they felt at peace. Sarah leaned against Gentry, and he wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "Happy?" he asked softly. Sarah smiled, her head resting on his shoulder. "I carried fear for so long. I forgot what peace felt like," she said. "Now I remember." Gentry smiled as he looked out over the horizon, his arm around the woman he loved, the children they had made their own. "That day, I found you in the snow," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "I thought I was saving you." Sarah lifted her head and smiled at him. "You did save us," she said. "No," Gentry said, his voice filled with warmth and certainty. "You saved me. All three of you." They stood together, watching the sunset as a family, knowing that they had finally found their home. Because sometimes the family you find in the snow is the one you were meant to have all along.